Good afternoon. Colonial statues of slave traders and kings have been toppled or vandalized in the US, the UK, New Zealand, Belgium, and others. I was drawn to the monuments in my hometown amid this historical reckoning. What would a historical reckoning look like in a country colonized 3 times for a total of over 400 years? What do contexts of multiple colonialisms look like, and how could scholars approach confounding post-colonial situations decolonially? Decolonization has emerged as a theory, process, project, and commitment that has become a buzzword in the academy and mainstream conversations. What are the limits of discussions about decolonization happening elsewhere when transposed in multiply colonized places? To answer these questions, I will first talk about the widely cited literature on decolonization from North and South America, and then in the Philippines. Looking at varied perspectives on decolonization prompts us to remember that decoloniality could unfold in different ways in different places. Thus, decolonization theory and projects must not be used as a formula in the same way that analytical concepts in anthropology have become routine. Then, I zoom in onto my hometown and discuss 3 local monuments to illustrate the challenges in directly transposing decolonization theory in particular places. Oops. So as you can see on the slide, the Philippines was colonized 3 times by Spain, the US, and Japan. Discourses about decolonization are grounded in a diverse range of intellectual roots emerging from a shared critique of the enduring repercussions of imperialisms worldwide. Many Latin American theorists, such as those appearing in the collection that you can see on the screen, use the term decolonization to refer to the point at which the colonized or the formerly colonized starts critiquing the persistent racialized, gendered, classed, and sexual hierarchies that Europe imposed upon the rest of the world under the banners of enlightenment and modernity. Beyond constructing an analytic, Walter Mignolo orients us to understand decolonization as a project that builds decolonial futures, which means that it works as both theory and agenda. Decolonization is also an academic project that critiques long-held disciplinary traditions. In Decolonizing Anthropology, anthropologists expose the politics of canon setting, which have, quote, peripheralized and erased significant contributions made by peoples of color and women from the canon, end quote. End quote. Thus, scholars must expand citation practices beyond the canon, which means genuinely recognizing pluriversal instead of universal perspectives. Opening ourselves to decolonizing literature would open space for engaging with non-Western worldviews that must be seen as theories in their own right. Meanwhile, Unanga scholar Eve Tuck and Wayne K. Young write about decolonization in the context of North America as a settler colonial nation state. They push for a framework that is not used as a mere metaphor, such that it has become superficially adopted by academics and activists and used loosely to supplant earlier calls for social justice, critical theory, and method. For example, decolonizing the university curriculum is a mere metaphor. Decolonization must be material, according to the authors, which means for them the recognition of indigenous sovereignty. To put it simply, decolonization in North America's context begins with acknowledging that the colonizers must return the land that was stolen from the original inhabitants. Aboriginal author Bruce Pascoe debunks also the doctrine of terra nullius, or nobody's land, that was used to justify settler colonialism, and that perpetuated a myth of non-activity and non-productivity in places which he argues were already cultivated and managed by Aboriginal peoples thousands of years before colonial arrival. Among indigenous authors, understanding that land as a resource exploited by empire and as a site of generational dispossession and suffering lies at the colonial project's heart. Considering how decoloniality proceeds in multiply colonized countries such as the Philippines, I take with me Young's insight that decolonization will take a different shape in the many post-colonial, neo-colonial, imperial contexts around the world. Yang acknowledged that decolonization is complicated by the varied histories of settlement apart from Europe's. Settlers came to native lands in North America in many forms as enslaved workers, as colonized peoples recruited into the military, as high or low skilled laborers, among others, creating a diverse group of settlers, which then, according to Young, exponentially complicates what is meant by decolonization. Thus, even in the North American context, decolonization might look different for various groups. Taking these conversations to Southeast Asia, I agree with Juno Salazar Pareñas that it is essential to interrogate the transferability of decolonizing approaches and projects in other places beyond the Western Hemisphere. Drawing from her fieldwork on human-animal relations in Sarawak and pointing to the specificity of knowledges circulated in her field site, Pareñas writes that decoloniality cannot be one-size-fits-all vocabulary. Decoloniality, Pareñas argues, engages with anti-Blackness, white supremacy, and settler colonialisms, concepts that are not sufficient in explaining local knowledges in Sarawak. Within the framework of decoloniality, her informant's references to interspecies relations would be summarily called what she calls indigenous knowledge, which she argues fetishizes the indigenous. She points out that the modernity imposed on colonized peoples make it, quote, difficult to salvage resilient indigenous knowledge, end quote. Rather than indigenous knowledge, her Iban and Malay informants profess ignorance because colonialism disrupted the transfer of knowledge intergenerationally. In many places in Southeast Asia, indigenous knowledge blended with those introduced by modernity. In such cases, what might be regarded as indigenous could instead be an amalgamation of knowledges from cultural encounters. Thus, applying decoloniality in Southeast Asia as it was used in the West for Pareñas would be a misappropriation and to an extent, she says, culturally imperialist. Tracing the ripening of the colonial discourse in the Philippines points us to a very long genealogy of projects that include a series of anti-colonial revolutions and intellectual engagements. The indigenization of the Philippine Academy in the 70s and 80s was part of Filipino scholars' examination of colonial or neo-colonial structures such as education that have become deeply embedded in everyday life, consequently affecting Filipinos' perceptions about themselves. This can be likened to efforts in Latin America that Walter Mignolo calls epistemological decolonization, which critiques the supposedly universal ways of making and communicating meaning. Intentions of the school of thought espoused by Filipino scholar Virgilio Enriquez, whose work appears on the screen, were rooted in desires for liberatory thinking. Scholars such as Enriquez channeled their energy to debunking myths about Filipino culture and personality that were earlier often described by Western scholars negatively. They designed research methods that were said to be more appropriate to local cultural norms and expectations. As Filipino scholars sought to extricate themselves from the shackles of Eurocentric theory and methods, their project of indigenization dangerously reproduced universalisms. Liberation psychologists in the Philippines sought to contribute to universal psychology, which can only be realized if each group of people is adequately understood by themselves and from their own perspective. In this project of defining the terms of the new but local universal, scholars plucked out from a list of supposed indigenous worldviews to understand the so-called Filipino experience. Researchers heavily borrowed value concepts in the hegemonic language of Tagalog, which is the language spoken in Manila and surrounding areas, as it sought to foster national identity and consciousness. Ethno-linguistic diversity was overshadowed as scholars based in Manila looked for a national essence as it resisted the pejorative and essentializing interpretations of Filipino character and behavior by the West. Some scholars also excluded diasporic Filipinos in their analysis, arguing that they did not share the national consciousness of people born and raised in the Philippines. Such insight, unfortunately, flattened nuances while denying the historical and contemporary embeddedness of Filipino life in relations and socialities beyond the archipelago. This presentation today is called from a recently finished chapter that will be appearing in a forthcoming Philippine Studies reader. In that chapter that I just finished, I continue my discussion about how these seemingly decolonization debates in the Philippines, even if a bit problematic on one end, are linked to the cultivation of a so-called national imaginary that is also seen in various decolonial movements in Africa, South America, and other formerly colonized places. I won't go deeper into debates surrounding this due to lack of time, but we can return to them later in the Q&A. So for now, please allow me to return to the question that I opened earlier in the introduction. What are the implications of these debates in decolonizing knowledges in the post-colonial Philippines? I now introduce 3 monuments in my hometown in Bicol, Philippines, to illustrate a post-colonial puzzle in a multiply colonized hometown that complicates visions for what the colonial aspirations could look like locally. In 1898, after 333 years of colonization, Spain relinquished the Philippines to the US, together with Cuba, Puerto Rico, and Guam, under the Treaty of Paris. Nabua, my hometown, is a riverine town located in the southeastern part of Luzon Island, whose nickname, Town of Dollars, is linked with this colonial transition. Nabueños, or the people of Nabua, came to call their town Town of Dollars due to the wealth and prestige brought back home by Nabueño men who started joining the US Navy when the US colonial government started recruiting Filipinos to the lowest and racially segregated rank of steward in 1901. The town's official seal prominently features a US Navy man and an anchor, surrounded by taro and rice, the town's main agricultural products. The moniker highlights successful US-bound migration narratives, even if these mobilities were gendered and racialized. As stewards, young men from Nabua served in the naval kitchens, fixed bunks, and worked as personal assistants of naval officers to shine their boots, as many of my informants said. Nabua's local government embraces the town's self-ascribed moniker as well. Okay, just show a slide. And to show how my hometown looks like, this is a typical rice field, and the rice fields unfortunately get flooded during the typhoon season. And one of the main businesses or ventures of local peoples is crafts making, but it's also disappearing now. And the last photograph is a photograph of a party held in May. And this is the time when overseas migrant workers come home and celebrate during what is called the Balikbayan night or the returnees night. At the center of the town of Nabua stands a trinity of public monuments that gives an insight into the town's hybrid, layered, and entangled identities and histories. These monuments communicate the paradox at the heart of the post-colonial town's projects to craft and project their history. The first monument is of the 3 Agtas, at the main roundabout, which epitomizes Nabua's claim to indigeneity. Built in 1997 by the municipal government of Nabua, the statue depicts Agta carrying a bamboo-slit drum, sculpted as if offering a ceremonial dance to the gods. Ricardo Maria Nolasco describes the Agta as people with dark-colored skins, short stature, and kinky hair. The people of Nabua want to honor the Agta by elevating them to the most exceptional spot at the center of the town. Still, the Agda have, in fact, not resided in Nabua in recent memory. Non-Agda residents in the neighboring city of Iriga, where there are Agda settlements, criticize Nabua for its co-opting of the Agda group into its history-making through public monuments and its narrative on how it became a Christian town. On the 2nd of May every year, a street parade passes through the roundabout where the monument of the Agda stands. Nabueno children, youth, and adults representing various local groups participate in contemporary renditions of indigenous attire, indigenous quote unquote. Some participants wear colorful and glittery outfit adorned with elaborate jewel of golden beads and rings, reminiscent of costumes of Muslim tribes in Mindanao. Some don natural costumes made with tree bark, hemp, and native grass, carrying food offerings such as coconuts. Participants dance on the streets as they rhythmically beat sticks on their bamboo slit drums while chanting prayers to Balahala, or a pagan god. Others carry warrior shields painted with geometric patterns that are supposed to depict native aesthetics. Each team has a muse who carries the image of Inang Katipanan, or the Lady of the Covenant, a locally revered Marian icon who is believed to protect the town from natural disasters. Others blacken their faces with charcoal or grease to play agta. In these costumes, Nabueños' recognition of their ancestors is confusing and unclear, if not muddled. I'm not sure if you can hear the audio, but anyway, it looks like this. Okay, so just a little bit to show how it looks like. So the parade that I mentioned earlier ends at the quadrangle of my high school. So this place is actually where I finished my high school. And at my high school, the street parade participants convene into groups to perform Nabua's supposed foundation story through dance, while an accompanying narration is blasted on the speakers. The narrative is set sometime in the early years of Spanish colonial arrival in the area, which was composed of independent villages headed by chiefs. As the story goes, a local chief's daughter named Laipani, which is the lady with the muse that I showed earlier. So this lady in the second photo, she's supposed to be Laipani. So apparently Laipani suffered an ailment that the native healers would not cure. So Laipani was carried to the river so the community could begin their petition to the god, who was believed to reside there. On the way to the river, the group accompanying Laipani passed by a crowd of natives receiving baptism from a Spanish friar. The chief, or Laipani's father, reprimanded the natives for allowing themselves to be baptized into the Christian faith. At that instant, the chief fainted in his angered reprimand. The Spanish priest quickly baptized the chief as well, who then awoke, miraculously recovered. The sickly daughter who was healed after her baptism. The narrative has other iterations. Sometimes performances depict natural disasters, such as fire or earthquakes, and each disaster ends with the miraculous intervention of the divine. In the story about Nabua's first miracle, as also is depicted in this dance, Christian conversion brought by the colonial encounter marks the beginning of Nabua's salvation from life's uncertainties. What the narrative from the festival tells us is that of reduction, or the formation of settlements organized around the Christian faith following Spanish arrival, which in turn led to the transformation of settlements into compact encomiendas or villages that could be easily missionized and taxed, and whose residents could be recruited to work in the farms. The quote-unquote authentic narrative of harvest, indigeneity, and resilience from diseases and natural calamities in the festival were in fact manufactured only in 1974 under the leadership of the local mayor at that time, his wife, the school's district supervisors, and a cultural committee from Manila. An informant recalls that she was fifth grade at the Nabo Elementary School in 1975 when they were tasked to participate and to practice dance steps in the festival for the very first time. In Nabua and other places all over the Philippines, festivals sprouted in response to dictator Ferdinand Marcos's national program that tasked local leaders to craft a distinct brand for towns and cities that was supposed to cultivate a sense of local pride while participating in cultural events that could be marketed to local and international tourists. Interestingly, in this festival narrative, the local population is portrayed as a sickly people who needed salvation even if the colonial archives from the town indicate hundreds of deaths from diseases that were most likely brought in by the colonial arrival. For example, the local archives in Nabua documented in a book of records called the Cuaderno in 1689 that the pests arrived, 3 to 6 children and adults die daily. For 1729, cholera arrived in the entire province. The Cuaderno records numerous accounts about death from various diseases. The local archives also document forced conscription of local men for work elsewhere at undefined occupations, with mothers worrying that they might never see their sons again. Laipani does not appear in the archives, and her origin is unclear. The street parade, dance, performance, oral history, and claims to indigeneity celebrate a narrative of assimilation that echoes a history told from the standpoint of colonizers, in which the native population needed aid and salvation. On this day alone throughout the year, Nabuenos make claims to indigeneity as a form of tracing their roots, but not necessarily to reflect on the violences of multiple colonialisms on themselves. Meanwhile, the rest of the year, the monument of the Agta is affixed at the Centro, silently but prominently echoing racist and evolutionary colonial science about the supposed defeat of the original inhabitants in the town who had to withdraw to the mountains in the neighboring city of Iriga. Without consent or permission from the Agta, living only less than 5 miles away, the statue of the Agta and the cooptation of indigeneity during festivals appear like empty commemorations. Nabuenos have learned to participate, to perpetuate the racialized narratives of the Agta, whose monument shows them as frozen in time, as if they have nothing else to do but play bamboo slit drums and dance. Okay, let's go to the second monument. The second monument, nested in a small fenced park a few meters from the statue of the Agta, is named dedicated to the unknown soldier of Nabua. It is a rather unmonumental wall with textured cream-colored bricks, against which a replica rifle with a military hard hat on its muzzle is propped. Etched on a marble plaque embedded on the brick wall are the names of the 1962 Nabua Summer Festival Queen and her court, and the members of a local club of male professionals who helped raise funds to build the monument. The monument gives no indication for which alliance the honorable but unknown soldier of Nabua had fought. It remains clear until today if the town collectively honors the anti-Japanese guerrillas who took to the hills, or the Filipinos fighting with the united Philippine-US military forces, or perhaps even both. I have observed that people in Nabua prefer to keep some details unknown, wanting to send me the message that he knew about my genealogy. As I asked to interview him about his life story, a retired US Navy man told me that he has heard that one of my elders was a member of the guerrilla movement during the Japanese occupation. I was very excited to learn more and potentially discover revolutionary roots. But unfortunately, the Navy man refused to elaborate, saying that it might be a family secret kept away from us, the next generation. Sharing the list of US Navy retirees that I was planning to interview, my uncle, who's also a retired US Navy man, told me in a hushed tone to erase one of the names who had submitted fraudulent documents in their youth to join the US Navy, and for other reasons he would not say more. Interviewing the only son of the US Navy man from Nabua who was killed at the attack of Pearl Harbor and whose name is memorialized on the tablets of the missing in the Manila American Cemetery, I was told instructively, one does not rub fresh wounds. Listening to a shipmate narrate his life story during a recorded interview, which included forced labor in the Japanese imperial camps in the region when he was a teenager, leading to the lowest point of his life when he had to leave his wife behind as the US naval ship sailed away from Manila to invade Incheon in South Korea. A retired Navy man said or told me that there was so much he did not know despite his long-term friendship with the Navy man that I was interviewing. In my high school, there used to stand what was known to Nabuenos as the war-damaged building. It was a tired wooden building with capiz shell windows and creaky floors, elevated from the ground, supported by trunks of wood. We held typewriting lessons in one of its rooms, as there were not enough personal computers to support our learning. According to Nabuenos, the building was an outpost by the Japanese during World War II, or perhaps a clinic. People always seemed unsure when asked. When asked about the experience of war locally, would typically say they do not remember deaths nor abuses by the Japanese, even if massive atrocities were reported to other places in the Philippines. The war-damaged building in my high school, a witness to World War II history whose details locals do not seem to want to articulate, was demolished a few years ago without resistance from the Buenos, while peoples in other places might launch a call for a preservation of such historical artifact. If decoloniality is a project that aspires for decolonial futures following Mignolo, that includes reckoning with a painful past, and if it must involve people from the global south as tellers of knowledge in their own right, then decolonization is complicated by such celebrations of the unknown and by frames of mind that center non-revelation and silence. Okay, going to the third monument. Let me just drink. The third monument is a concrete obelisk that stands a couple of meters from the unknown soldier of Nabua, and that names a very specific alliance in historical narrative. This monument is a replica of the Washington Monument, flanked by the Philippine and American flags, built with donations from Nabuenos with US Navy legacies. At only about 5 meters in height, it is nowhere near the scale of the original, but occupies the center of the fenced park, somewhat blocking the unknown soldiers monument. Oops. As the iconic Washington Monument was built to honor Continental Army official and first US President George Washington, the replica was built to commemorate the ton of dollars' own great men. According to the memorial plate attached to its base, the monument was an initiative of the Nabua US Veterans Memorial Organization, built in recognition of military service of Nabuenos. The organization's emblem shows an American bald eagle resting on the cropped canton of both US and Philippine flags, encircled by a rope that serves as the emblem's border. The rope alludes to Nabuenos in the US Navy, with some of their names listed on the plaque under a heading that says "In Memoriam," even if the majority of the names listed have not yet sailed on. So sailed on is a term that my informants use when they want to refer to death of their fellow US Navy men or shipmates. So figures of crosses and KIA, or killed in action, are affixed after the names of those who have already sailed on or passed. The Nabuenos in the US Navy who have retired in Nabua are among the last of their kind. The recruitment of Filipinos into the US Navy stopped in 1991 when the Philippine Supreme Court voted on the unconstitutionality of the US bases in the Philippines as American colonization ended in 1946. As long as their health allows, the retirees exert energy in staging annually held activities such as a flags raising ceremony of both US and Philippine flags at the Centro of Nabua to commemorate the lives of those who served in the US military force, which also include their Nabueño shipmates. They donate buildings and infrastructure for public use named after themselves. They fund community feasts or collectively contribute resources for constructing memorials such as the Washington Monument's replica, which will hopefully stay on long after their deaths. The narratives by retirees that I have interviewed in my hometown also commonly reflect a lively and positive account of American colonization in the Philippines, even if the historical record tells of the grave destruction caused by colonial wars in the Philippines. Some of them acknowledge in subtle tones that their labor in the US Navy was racialized, gendered, and infantilized. The colonization, as we recall from what I have said earlier when I was discussing the different meanings of the colonization, could refer to the point at which the colonized realize their oppression. Despite their shared testimonies about American benevolence, the retirees talked about the past as temporally marked by periods of political and economic instability caused by competing empires on the Philippine soil and by elite post-colonial governments, which have caused additional harm instead of repair. They talked about intergenerational dispossession as descendants of poor peasants with minimal possessions. But also, for the retirees, the US Navy opened a space for resisting the trope of the indolent Indio, or the indolent Indian, ascribed by the Spanish to the colonized natives. While they were called boys by American naval officers, even if they were adults, and even if they had to perform menial tasks which included shining officers' boots, they saw the Navy as a passage through which they could renegotiate their position in Nabua's hierarchical social class and orient their labor on the ships back to their left-behind family in Nabua. In this colonized people's future, kin, and community-oriented projects that were also hinged on capital accumulation, they arguably disrupted assumptions about the modern Filipino subject that was meant to be individualized by American colonial education. A decolonial frame emerging from settler nations such as the US would raise critique against institutions such as the military that were among the actors in the racial capitalist ventures of empires that dispossessed indigenous peoples of their ancestral land, extracted resources and labor overseas that funded and powered imperial projects. Tuck and Yang recognized that settlers in North America came in many forms, including assimilated colonized peoples, including Nabuenos, who found themselves leaving farmlands to work in the lowest and historically segregated US Navy rank. Nabuenos in the US Navy commonly deny their participation in these imperial projects. They highlighted that their work in the mess halls and bunks were merely peripheral and not ensanguined, unlike their US-born counterparts who carry guns and kill enemies on the ground, as they told me. Looking at the retirees' case, decoloniality appears to be premised on contributing to global history inscribed in local memory. Public monuments such as the replica, in cooperation with local governments and residents, and private monuments such as their personal mausoleums, as you can see on the screen, are productively deployed by retirees in crafting a distinct identity, in asserting relevance despite being in the margins of historiography, and in claiming participation in history making. The replica of the Washington Monument, among their other projects, reflects their desires to be memorialized kindly after death in the modest town experiencing the after effects of multiple colonialisms, where their dollar remittances were recuperative for kin and community. The monuments in the town of dollars that I discussed in this presentation are not standalone projects. Altogether, they reflect a conundrum about how decolonization becomes a challenging project in a context in which the aftermaths of multiple colonialisms have muddled daily life. The Three Agtas monument signifies how formerly colonized peoples may craft memory-making projects that echo Europe's racist evolutionary perspectives. Nabuenos unwittingly tokenize the indigenous other and celebrate narratives that subdue their experience of dispossession and violence as peoples who became entangled in various imperial projects. The monument dedicated to the unknown soldier of Nabua materializes the ambiguity that characterizes people's understanding of their hometown as a site of war with confusing alliances. The replica of the Washington Monument makes visible people's desire to be remembered for their contribution to the making of the town through their racialized labor in the US naval ships, narratives of which they tend to downplay during conversations. Within critical and decolonial theory, these monuments would be seen as problematic to varying degrees because they exemplify formerly colonized people's unchecked complicities in imperial projects, their miseducation, and ignorance about themselves. These monuments would seem to signal a need for epistemological revision so that false consciousness could be corrected. The monuments reflect only some of the Buenos reflections on the colonialisms that unfolded locally, all oriented at offering supposed respectful commemorations for the indigenous, the unknown, and the elderly, even if these articulations might be imperfect. The monuments in Nabua are unlike the colonial monuments facing historical reckoning globally. Ravaged over the years by tropical storms, the public library and school building donated by a retired US Navy man are now gone, not staying long enough after the philanthropist had sailed on. Potential historical markers such as the war-damaged building in my high school, even if they could be recuperated, fall without much noise or resistance from residents. Elsewhere, the colonization movements were envisioned in the context of an epistemic break after centuries of colonization. In South Africa, this epistemic break has produced a student-led liberation project that launched, for example, the colonial projects such as the Rhodes Must Fall movement. Decolonizing local epistemologies is a luxury that many cannot afford. However, I want to think that an attempt to open debates whether the monuments in Nabua must fall or not, among other confounding reverberations of colonialisms, would not be a pointless project if we were to look at it as potentially opening a space for inquiring into people's supposed resilience to instead meditate on trauma and to plan for action for repair and healing. In the town of dollars, public and collective conversations about multiple colonial trauma have actually not yet occurred. The conflicting narratives that the trinity of monuments in the town of dollars altogether register on a monumental scale reflect the anxious responses of a people to locally experience multiple colonialisms. These anxieties cemented in the form of monuments fixed in the town's most central location are hyper-visible structures with related histories that could be triangulated. From these, the colonial futures could be assembled. That's all. And this is a Christmas display at the center of my hometown in front of the Washington Monument last year. That's all. Thank you. Mabalos. Salamat.